Welcome. My name is Kyle Farrell, and I'm a PhD fellow in the Division of Urban and Regional Studies at KTH Royal Institute of Technology. And I'm also an associate of the Department of Economics at Harvard University. You are listening to the Delphi Conversations, a discussion series hosted by the Center for the Future of Places here at KTH in Stockholm, Sweden. The Delphi Conversations investigates a wide range of issues related to urbanism with a specific focus towards designing and planning for social diversity. Today, I'm joined by distinguished experts from around the world, each bringing insights from their own experiences spanning policy, research, and practice, and also representing global and regional perspectives. Maybe it's best if I give you guys an opportunity to introduce yourself before we move forward, starting with you, Kunle.
Yes, my name is Kunle Adeyemi. I'm an architect and urban designer based in Lagos and Amsterdam, and the founder of Kunle, which is an architecture, design, and urbanism practice focused on developing cities and communities around the world.
My name is Cecilia Martinez. I'm from Mexico, and I'm an architect, urban designer, planner, and I'm now retired, but I've done all kinds of activities in relation to all those topics, from working with government, national, locally, working in the private sector, working with NGOs, working for the UN, with communities. So I'm just enjoying right now being here with you, and thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you. My name is Viktoria, Walden. I'm a social anthropologist, but I work at White, which is an architecture firm, a big architecture firm in Scandinavia. And it's interesting as an anthropologist focusing on people's relation to people and places to actually work really close to architects and create a more social, sustainable world. So I have the best job lifting social aspects in urban planning and architecture.
And I'm Michael Mehaffy, and I'm a senior researcher here at KTH, and I'm the director of the Future of Places Research Network. And we're a partnership that evolved out of an original partnership of UN Habitat and developing some of the key messages that I think we'll talk about a little bit. But I think our key interest is to connect research into practice and develop the basis for evidence-based implementation of the new urban agenda.
The title of today's conversation is Rapid Urbanization and the New Urban Agenda. This comes nearly 1 year after the adoption of the New Urban Agenda at Habitat 3 in Quito, Ecuador, and nearly 2 years after the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, one of which is directed towards sustainable cities and communities. Over the course of the next hour, we will cover a range of topics: the challenges being posed by the contemporary urban transition in developing countries, efforts being put forward to find innovative solutions at local, national, and global levels, the potential of public space to build livable cities inclusive to all, and the role of the New Urban Agenda in uniting all of this. I can comfortably say that given the high degree of intellect surrounding me, today's conversation promises to be nothing short of exceptional. So I would like to thank you all for being here with us today. Maybe I'll begin by asking a fairly broad question. So what are the biggest challenges underscoring the contemporary urban narrative? Maybe you can kick us off, Cecilia.
Well, you mentioned before that we have to think globally and then act locally. And if we think globally, I think the most important problem today, or the most important challenge, is we're losing the quality of life in general. But then if you think about challenges regionally, I think it's different what's happening in Europe from what's happening in Latin America to what's happening in Africa. And one of those big problems or big challenges is nowadays we live in cities, most of the population of the world, but we still is not clear to the people living in those cities what are the real problems. I think more and more we're lacking data to precisely know how to measure problems today. So we sort of sense some problems, but sometimes we don't see them clearly. At least most of the population that lives in the cities don't know very clearly what their problems are. And the same with the people managing the cities. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges today.
On the point about data, I find it very interesting that we're in effect drowning in data right now in many ways, and part of the challenge is to select the data that we need to operate on, and that's part of what we hope to do, certainly with the research program that we have. But that's an enormous challenge remaining, I think.
You're absolutely right. I think we're flown with data, but then sometimes it's not the right data.
Exactly.
Or sometimes we're just mixing things and we really don't know what is the data for. Right. So I think it's about time we start sort of narrowing down to our own cities, and especially those that are managing the cities, to understand the implications of what data is missing and what do we need to know so we can start really solving problems.
Yeah, I'm actually quite fascinated by your definition of the main challenge being the quality of life, and I think that is quite easy to simply put, because that really is what we should aspire for, good quality of life. But I would also then perhaps agree with Michael that there's perhaps some evidence of the issues that are really making the quality of life difficult, and whether it is pollution or transportation or inequality, or there are lots of things that I think are tangible and maybe begin to lead towards the bigger issues, which I would define as the challenges of urbanization itself, economy, and perhaps the second, in my view, is climate change. It's really and that has an environmental impact that has all kinds of ramifications at different levels.
Yeah, and I so enjoyed your answer, because I've been thinking in the same, as Cecilia said, I've been thinking about governance and smart governance. We need great governance to handle this urbanization that is happening right now and the consequences of it. We have the conflict between the city and the countryside. We have, of course, the climate impact. We have segregation. I mean, we are building market-driven economy for people that have money, and poor are not getting anything. So segregation is increasing everywhere.
Yeah.
There's so much to handle, and to handle this, we need to have great governance. And I think that when I was in Quito last year, and I was listening to the mayors at this Habitat 3, which was really interesting and great, but to have, I don't remember who started the conversation about the cities being the engine in the future of a sustainable development, and not countries. It's the cities that are being the engine in this. And this really, I've been thinking about this for a year. So our cities need to have really smart, great governance in order to handle this. And that will also include educating the people, the society, on how to live sustainable. Because they don't know about how to handle their garbage. They won't by themselves make the decision to use the bike instead of the car. So we have to help them.
So last year we were all there in Quito for Habitat 3 and the adoption of the new urban agenda. A year before that was the Sustainable Development Goals. So now we have these global policy agendas. Do you see those being a productive means for moving forward? What was wrong with the last agendas?
Well, that's the huge challenge, isn't it? Implementation. Yes. And I think we all recognize that. But picking up on several points that you all made earlier, I think the challenge that we're really grappling with is what Jean Clos referred to as a new paradigm that we really need in urban planning and in thinking about cities and how we actually harness the capacity of cities to do these things that you were just alluding to. And I think that's an enormous change in the way we're thinking. And as you were saying, Cecilia, thinking about how to engage informality and how to, if you will, change the operating system that we're using to manage the growth of cities. That to me is an enormous implementation challenge.
But then again, you mentioned precisely the combination of doing research with action and then action with managing. And I think one of the other big challenges we need today is how do you put all this together? Because nowadays we talk, just as you mentioned, If you ask me, for example, in Latin America, transportation is one of the biggest problems that we have. But then people think only on transportation.
Right.
And if you think only of transportation, what is happening is you have this wonderful maybe railroad or metro or whatever, and then people commute 3 hours because they live far, far away. And then people are not thinking about the planning issues of how do you create spaces and where housing can really have nearby services, good services and employment and so on. So one thing cannot go without the other.
Absolutely.
I think we need to really start thinking a much more holistic way. And sometimes it's very difficult to have. I think one of the other things that we lack is leadership, good leadership within cities. So they would understand that all these things have to be working together to make cities work. And you're absolutely right in the sense that cities, I think in a positive way, cities are the engines to economy and to better quality of living and so on. But we really need to put all these things into perspective and make them work.
And I think that one of the biggest challenges is, and I also took this with me from the Quito, the Habitat 3 meeting, which was really interesting. It was a seminar with mayors or people that governs the city and the researchers from the university, the scholars. And they were talking beside each other because the researcher was saying you have to have enough evidence. You come to us with a question. It's going to take 3 years for us to get the solution. And the mayors, I have 1 week.
Right.
Why don't you understand that it's good enough? You don't have to get the best solution. Just good enough is good enough.
Right.
And then I think that this is where we practitioners, consultants, clients come in.
Right.
Like we can actually bridge that.
Right.
But in order for us to work together with the policymaker who makes the policies but do not implement them with the best intention, and I'm thinking about Goal 18 of the sustainable goals, and I'm thinking that's a great goal because it's all about how we are going to work together to make this happen, and that's the biggest challenge in implementing the new urban agenda.
I couldn't agree more.
But one of the critiques I do make for the Sustainable Development Goals is we have to realize, because I was there, I've been in New York and working with all these things, and I saw how they were being implemented. Because it's a worldwide thing, we always have to think that sustainable development, any goals that come from the UN are sort of very basic. But it certainly provides us at least with the main ideas that we can start working with. So let's not pretend that sustainable development goals are going to be the solution to the world, because they will not be the solution. They're just like the starting point to give us precisely the chance to discuss these things and see how do we get from there and then start moving, really creating our own policies and our own perspectives from there.
Fortunately, we have some implementers in the room. Kunle, it'd be great to hear your reflections on it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the SDGs are certainly a framework for understanding or let's say dimensioning the complex issues that are affecting the world today. And they, of course, vary from places to places. In different regions, you have different kinds of urgencies. And I think, like Viktoria rightly said, we always have these challenge between research and the policymakers or people in government, because the people in government have huge urgencies, and the urgency is driven by the pressure of urbanization, essentially, the pressure that people are moving into these areas, into the cities. There's scarce resources. There's a lot of needs to provide infrastructure to solve problems, healthcare. So it's constant, this influx of challenges, and there's not enough. So it's about how do you actually allocate resources, and both material resource and intellectual resource, human resource, human capital. How do you allocate them in ways that would immediately address problems that are urgent? So, I mean, I think one of the things I have learned in practice is that, we can't imagine that all of that intelligence resides on only the, let's say, the academics or the professionals, right? right now I believe that actually there's a lot of intelligence in just everyday people. And how do we learn to harness that intelligence so that we are working with their own kinds of the movements, things that they're already doing, as opposed to trying to create something completely new. And I think that's really perhaps a key into tackling problems that are urgent, but also tackling problems that are relevant.
I think that's a great point in picking up on the idea of engaging informality, that we have to empower these networks of different people, different actors. And listening to you all talk, it occurred to me the blind man and the elephant. You know, everybody sees things from their own point of view, their own silo, and what we've got to do is transcend that. And Cecilia, I think you're right that the Sustainable Development Goals and the New Urban Agenda are really just a broad agreement, a broad framework. But I think it's really historic that we have these agreements now and the Paris Climate Accords, because we actually have, 193 countries unified on a common set of ideals, at least. And that's a major moment in history, I think. But obviously now we have to move forward with
Now it's time to start working.
Exactly.
But it's amazing as well. You bring up, the knowledge of the people on the ground, knowledge and experience as well. These people have been solving problems for a long time, right? And there is a tendency to look towards the experts or the researchers or the policymakers, but if anything, these people have more experience than any of them put together at solving the issues on the ground. The people who live everyday life, whether it's in developing countries or developed countries, there's always mitigation strategies to deal with these things. So leveraging that,
I think that I started to work at White about 7 or 8 years ago, when environmental questions were really hard to get to architectural assignments and urban planning assignments. But now, in the past 3 or 4 years, I've been quite hopeful, because we work with dialogue mostly. We do interviews. We're down in the ground talking to people, trying to see what their behavior are, what they think, what they want. We try to translate what they're saying to us in a quite qualitative way, in-depth interviews, and try to make them end up on some sort of a drawing, become a plan or something. But people are now. When they ask for us to work with them, they're happy to have social impact assessment. They want to know what the kids said. They want to know what the women are saying. So something is happening and it's happening quite quick actually. We have a lot to do. I used to be alone, the only sort of anthropologist in our firm, and now there's 12 of us working nationally, internationally. And our architect colleagues are really loving these methods. So we're actually getting architects into our group, which is so interesting, because this is how we get practical with the questions. And we will ask ourselves, how do we in this project actually work with the goals? Are we lifting goal 5 here? Are we sure we're on 17? Because it's sustainable development. We should always be working on 17. Are we sure that we're not only drawing a house, because that's just a function. To get the house, it's a function. Are we working long term? Are we working with developing a society? How can this house actually contribute to the society? So it's actually a joy for us to have the goals, because it's a map on how to work sustainable. Then if we succeed or not, that's we'll see. But we're using it. We're really using it.
Well, it's encouraging to hear. I mean, the way these global policy documents have been referred to are as frameworks, guidelines, maps at this table. And I think from the perspective of those who are responsible for implementing it, all of us in our other jobs as well, that's kind of the way to treat it as well. It offers that flexibility that, it's not like previous charters that we've been locked in as a result. So. Yeah. But one thing that keeps coming up is people at the center of it, livability, quality of life. A new element in both the Sustainable Development Goals and the New Urban Agenda is the role of public space. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more and hear your reflection.
Absolutely.
Well, that's music to my ears, of course, because at our center we are very interested in public space as a kind of unifying framework that touches on all the other issues. We're talking about getting out of silos and being more joined up and holistic in the way we do things. And public space is a great sort of framework for doing that, I think, because we immediately touch on all the other aspects of urban life and what cities give to people, how they give those benefits to people. So I think, Kyle, as you and I have talked many times, the ability to focus on public space as a kind of leverage for the other aspects of the new urban agenda is really important from our point of view. And so a big part of our focus is to look at the public space research and try to distill down the actual useful lessons that are useful for practice. We're doing a database, as you know, looking at a number of the research publications, the literature out there, and how that can be translated into action. But I think we're only one node of a much larger network that needs to be built of knowledge. And the last section of the New Urban Agenda talks about how important it is to build these knowledge networks, peer-to-peer sharing, and knowledge into action. So that's, you can tell I'm enthusiastic about it.
maybe it would be interesting to take from that point, which I completely agree with you, Michael, and do a little bit of history, just for those that are not so aware. I'm
Please.
the older one here, so I've been through that. Just to remind you, because you talk about Habitat 3, and this is part of what came out from Habitat 3. But if you think about it, I mean, habitats come every 20 years only, and it's to revise precisely the global agenda. So 40 years before, when the first Habitat first came out, I mean, I was still a student, but I remember my professors telling us, what was the concern. And at that time, the concern was a basic need, which was housing. And people were very aware of human settlements and what was going on in the countryside especially, and then in some of the cities. But then the next 20 years, the whole thing changed because the world became more urbanized. So as we moved along, then it was the issue of urbanization. But urbanization per se is still a word we're using, and we are not so sure what people are talking about when we use it. And then 20 years later, we realize that Habitat was just doing housing, and housing was moving precisely to creating the wrong urban planning. Because nowadays, a big challenge is that houses itself, we're just creating economy, but we're not creating cities. Right. So some of the worst slums today are housing projects far away, because that's where the cheap land is. Right. And now we have the new challenge, which is what do we do with those shanty towns, that are far away from God knows where. So that's when we realized that it was time to start discussing in this new Habitat 3 thing precisely the importance of public space and placemaking, because that's where the action of the cities is happening. And that's what really brings the economy and brings the social inclusion and social cohesion. It's not only housing. And housing, as we move along, housing is more and more reduced. So people are spending more time in public spaces. Now, public spaces, again, if you think about Africa or Latin America, now even the European cities, because they have a lot of migration now to think about, is we have to think, again, in a more integral way when we say placemaking and public spaces. So public spaces has to be from the sidewalk, which sometimes we don't have. Sometimes we just have a road, dirt road, and that's the end of the story. So how do we make these things happen today? A serious, and not only that, I think sustainable development goals could be achieved if we think about public spaces. Because if you think of a public space that is completely done, we'll have to have water, infrastructure, telecommunications, and then everything will be included.
And it's for everybody.
And it's for everybody, and it will be inclusive, will be really, and if you provide certain amount of activities that would come from the population itself, their needs and their expectations, then you can start really creating a complete thing, that will provide quality of life.
No, absolutely. Well, thanks a lot. That's a really nice recap of history.
Very much so, yeah.
Very well said. I think it's really true. The shift from the problems or the main challenges of housing to the realization that there's just urbanization and then much more complex issues that actually begin to dissect the need for more things than housing. I think that's really interesting. And indeed, public space, I think the ratio that we've always imagined of of actual occupiable space or livable space and then public space is starting to change. And that's just because people are also using spaces differently now. And that has a direct relationship with the quality of life. And I think essentially public space becomes sort of like you said, Michael, kind of a leveling ground for society. And the more public space you have, the more opportunities for people to be more inclusive, to interact, to solve the problems themselves. It's a melting pot for humanity essentially, and the environment. I would add. Yeah.
The difficult thing though is that we who work with it, we know the public space is like God for us. It's like the best. We know that it affects public health, it affects everything. It creates integration, inclusion. But the market that are still driving everything don't want to pay for it.
Right.
They want houses, because then they get money.
That's a
and
good
that's
point.
that's a difficult battle.
Right.
And even for the politicians to actually take that on, it's you feel that they are there for the short term all the time. So I'd like to just reprogram everyone and start thinking in long term, thinking about our children growing up.
Well, let me bring something that we did as well in Mexico originally, and I was involved with that. We were discussing a long time ago all the issue of housing, and we were able to place housing, at least in the country, when we put figures and numbers into it, and when we were able to show that housing was producing economy. Then we got it all wrong, because then it was just economy and then people forgot about the quality of housing, but that's a different issue. But I think we certainly need now the data, and that's what I mean about getting the appropriate data of what's the meaning of having public space, proper public space or place making with the quality of the construction that you get. And if you measure that, you will be able to prove that enhance the economy, that you can probably create better taxes, and all that can pay precisely for better public spaces.
We're very much interested in that question and start part of our research, and the whole question of how do you value public space? How do you monetize the externalities, as they say, of public space, and make that something that the government officials will pay attention to, the developers will pay attention to, because they get some kind of income stream, that it becomes part of the feedback system, which we really desperately need to do. And that's what I mean when I say we've got to change the operating system, which right now rewards these things in a silo and doesn't get the joined up system. And so this is incredibly important to get that data feeding back.
And reflecting on this, I've been involved in some initiatives where a lot of it is to convince the local governments the value of public space, and usually that has to be some sort of economic value as well. So investing in public space can be beneficial for you. It increases the values of properties around, which could be used to leverage taxes in the future. Of course, there needs to be mechanisms in place to make sure that it doesn't lead to gentrification or segregation and these sorts of things. But a very complex discussion. You had noted that putting public space at the center of it brings all these other issues in and all the challenges as well, which is...
Well, I always, when I speak in conferences and so on, I always like to remember history, and I'm talking about 16th century. I mean, this is colonial times. And all the cities in Latin America were precisely built around a square.
Right.
And it was, there were so simple rules. It was put a square, do the streets around, and then create all the land use and so on.
We need that kind of elegance in our planning.
But not only that, today we still use those squares, and they work well. And it's amazing, because all of a sudden you see how cities are growing, and then they grow with shopping malls and all this, and then you see that there's a lack of streets and no more public space and so on, and that's why quality of life is beginning to diminish. But it was so simple, and it's still updated nowadays, so it's not that complicated to understand what was going on.
I agree with you that we have a lot of lessons that we can draw from looking at the anthropology and the history and the putting the human at the center is so much a key part of it, instead of the the numbers and the current system.
I'd like to talk a little bit more also about the connecting these sorts of issues. We have these global policy agendas. How do we scale that down to connect with the issues on the ground? But also we have a lot of lessons we learn on the ground, and that can be scaled up into lessons.
Well, I think one of the big challenges, talking about challenges again, at least in Latin America, we talk a lot about the rule of law, and how for some of in our countries, it's very easy to start create laws. But then if you only have the law and you don't really get all to the bottom of getting into norms, standards, data, then everything becomes a bit shabby somehow, because then at the end, instead of helping, it's really going the other way around. Because if you don't have clear regulations, then politicians, private sector, they all sort of bend the law according to their needs and possibilities, just as you were mentioning before.
Yeah, you can game the system.
And yes, I was surprised that they were building this 30-story building next to where I lived. And I asked the local authorities, because my neighbors used to call me and said, this is wrong, there's no water here, and nobody knows what's going to happen, and what are the impacts, and so on. And I wasn't sure, so I asked the local authorities, and local authorities said, well, I'm not even sure about the pipes that are going beneath these places. So I thought, nobody knows. And regulations, well, it's not so clear if you can make it or not. So everybody was bending somehow the law. So it's sometimes very difficult if you just leave the laws without any meat, to really get clear exactly what are the recommendations, so what should be done, and should be for everybody. So to us, is one of the biggest challenges we have right now.
And it's very easy for people, if they're going to make money by doing that, to find ways around. And so I think that a key part of it is the economic incentives and disincentives to, things like land value tax and other topics that we've been talking about a lot as mechanisms to try to recalibrate the system away from that kind of short-term profit and towards long-term value.
And also from the down and up, there's such a power today in people. When people go to get, right now we have this Me Too movement. I mean, really, people can really create or demand a new world. And I'm thinking that maybe one of the reasons that we don't have that drive yet in urban planning and architecture is because it's not a subject in school. It's not a subject until you get interested in it and you go to architect school, and that's you're quite old. I mean, we need to get that from first grade. Architecture and urban planning affects everything in our life. We should have a subject teaching it from the time you're 6 or 7 years old, so that you can organize.
Beware of architects. Sorry, and I'm one as well. I think we got it all wrong from Le Corbusier on, because architectural schools are still teaching today that architects know better. They don't ask people.
Right.
That was for years and years and years. I never understood why Le Corbusier got it so wrong in terms of planning. Planning is very different from architecture.
No, we should do the subject should be sustainable urban design.
Well, exactly.
Right.
So that's what you're learning.
Yeah. But architects feel that they know how to do it because they know how to design. And the big mistake is they assume. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong,
No, absolutely.
but usually they have the ideas and they think they know better how people should live.
Yeah.
And that was a big mistake Le Corbusier did.
I mean, I think... Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, they're also asking a certain set of questions that's very interesting, and they're not asking the questions about the people. They're asking the questions about the objects and about,
and design.
Museum Charter and the
beauty.
The Athens Charter of 1933. It says the three major forces of urbanism are sunlight, greenery, and space.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What about the human being? Isn't the human being and the connectivity,
That's why I started to work with this within architecture and urban planning a long time ago, because I realized that they were more interesting how frogs were walking and having sex even. But they didn't know anything about humans. How do humans
It's interesting,
Right.
I mean, I completely agree. And I think the issue with architecture, or the way we've been trained in the last 20, 30 years or 50 years, I would say, it's been very focused
50
on...
years, I was there.
It was very focused on form, you know. It's about, I mean, of course, even form, it's about the final outputs as a built form, and there's very little relationship with people. And when you actually have architects that are trained to engage people, they are trained to engage a client.
Right.
A client as an individual who has a very specific need,
Yeah.
and very rarely would you even expand that to maybe an organization.
Right.
Architects have not been trained mostly to understand people, and particularly in this age where we're talking about population growth, urbanization, we have to learn to deal with people as our clients, you know. So it's almost, it's public architecture. It's like public health, you know.
Exactly.
You know, you're dealing with individuals as a patient, and suddenly you're starting to deal with larger issues of humanity. So architects have to use different tools to understand that complex dynamics of urbanism, of the way life, people interact with space, and you know, if you have to design a house for someone, you need to think about how many people would also occupy it, because that's just the potential that is most obvious today. So we're always sort of led to think about form, to think about design and material, but not issues like economy, the social politics dynamics, the environment. You know, we're not really pushed to do that. So I think indeed it needs to change. Yeah.
And it's been changing since even the firm that I work with, there's a lot of us. It's almost 1,000 of us now. We have offices all over. I mean, we just opened one up in England 2 years ago. And I think that they've been they understand our motto is to put people in the center. But I think it's because we do travel. I work a lot in Kenya, in Nairobi, and I'm trying to get to do some stuff in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia as well. And I feel like we have the willingness up here in Scandinavia where things are quite good, really. I mean, we have the money, the technology. We just have to have the will, and then we can fix everything in Sweden, really. But I do think that with that drive, we should be working in Africa and South America. And I mean, and with the... I always feel really happy to be in Nairobi working, because what they say when I come and said, oh, finally, Sweden didn't send another engineer. Finally, they're sending a social planner that understands our needs. Yeah, we'll work with you. And I get like, I'm happy about this.
And there's another thing that I always like to clarify globally, which is, if you think about it, I used to say it in the UK a lot. You know, if you think about urbanizing the UK, it was easy. I mean, it's just a joke. We said 3 meters of pipe and that's it. But go to Brazil, which is almost a continent in itself. I mean, it's a never-ending story. Territories are enormous, and the same happens in Africa. So it's not the same issue. I mean, the challenge is enormous if you think about urbanization in that sense, because simply the territory. I mean, UK fits in one of our states. We have 32 states. I mean, just to give you an idea of the broad issue that we're facing. So we have to think seriously about those challenges as well.
At the same time, I'm kind of happy because there's, in East Africa, where I'm a lot, the step of infrastructure sort of we skipped it over. There's no telephone lines and stuff. So I think the chances of us planning in the right way are higher if we can get the cities and the government wanting to do that. But
with the right motive.
The light rail tram that just came up like that. Like, we want to have a tram. And there it is, and it's great. And I've actually taken a role in this. I see that if they want something, it can happen, and it could be sustainable. So I'm sort of excited but also worried because it's
happened so fast.
And one of the things I hear in your discussion is the tension between the top down and the bottom up, right? We're sort of talking about that, and really the challenge is how to marry those. How do we clearly need regional frameworks and infrastructure and so on, but we need to do those in a way that thinks about how the informality and the the crowdsourcing, the people acting at the neighborhood scale and the city scale can populate those frameworks. And that's a different way of thinking than we've had recently, where we're trying to over-design everything into the final state. So I think that's a really important shift in our paradigm, so to speak.
And one of the tendencies that is happening in developing countries, at least that's what I've seen lately, is that, just as you mentioned, Viktoria, sometimes you take the fashion. So it's, let's do the rapid transport system. But then every city wants to have one line. And then once the line is done, that's it. Okay, we have rapid transport system. And you think, this is not a system, this is a line. But no, that's, we already have it. So that's it, end of the story. They don't want to think in a systematic way. So I think going back to the initial thing that we said, we need the data, we need to improve it so you can scale it up. I mean, I think the big challenge is, how do you get all these ideas of saying it's not one little solution, it's a whole systematic thing that has to work together in order to make the cities work properly. I think, to me, it's one of the big challenges today with the rule of law, with the planning system, with regulations and so on. I mean, it's all linked together.
No, I think that's a very valid point, and from the beginning of the conversation, you brought that holistic understanding. So then my question for you guys then is, with the magnitude, the pace and scale of urbanization unfolding in Africa, Asia, a lot of Latin American countries as well, how do we position ourselves to deal with these issues where right now we're often responding to them and not really having that proactive foresight to put in the legislation or planning ahead or any of these things? It's just more mitigating the small problems to try to deal with them.
Well, I think we've been giving a lot just to governments. We keep talking about governments, local government, national government. And I think a lot has to do, especially with technology today and all this networking. I think it's one of the key issues today. We need to start working together. The networking, the professionals.
Decentralizing.
Decentralizing, and bringing all these ideas and put the pressure into, let's move forward and get some ideas done, get some practice going, and then show it. I've been working with the board of WRI, World Resource Institute in Mexico, and they have this very nice motto. It's not mine, it's from them. And they say, count it, change it, scale it. I think it's brilliant, because I think that's what we all need to start doing, put that perspective into how can you show a good example, but then make sure that you will bring it up to scale of what is needed. But then if you have the data and you understand the figures, then you will know exactly in numbers what's the scale that you have to reach. So I think that's to me, that's one of the challenges that we can do in scaling up with the networks, with the proper networks.
And this word network is so key. I think we're learning so much now that's so incredibly useful about social networks and interconnections of people and interconnections of space and other systems that give us something to go on, as Jane Jacobs put it, a place to kind of intervene in the system to have some leverage. And public space is certainly one of those. Infrastructure is one of those. Governance can be one of those. I think the new urban agenda is one of those, because it does change the conversation, and it begins to open up the process of changing the operating system, as I referred to it, the incentives and the laws and the codes and all the other things that over time are going to have to be changed to improve the outcomes. So I'm hopeful that we're on the right path here with implementation, and that we have the right tools and strategies. But this is a moment that we can't lose. We need to use this to as Jean-Claude puts it, move into a new paradigm. And maybe the word paradigm is overused, but I do think it's the right one. It's a systems approach that we have to take.
And then things like what you're doing right here, Kyle. I mean, I hope that this can be shown to universities or
Yeah.
communities or grassroots or NGOs. So we should, keep pushing the agenda to see, what are the results. Yeah.
So, are we optimistic about the future? Pessimistic about the future? Kunle, do you want to?
Well, I mean, I think we have no choice but to be optimistic.
I like that.
I'm always optimistic. I like to say I'm probably a realist, but an optimistic realist. In the sense that we do have to hope for the best, but be very aware of the challenges and the things that we have to tackle to get there. And yes, I would say, of course, when you look at the patterns and you think about things that are happening in the world, it looks like it's all seems to be falling apart. But I think humans are extremely adaptable beings, and we're incredibly intelligent beings. And even though we're having these conversations and we sit in intellectual circles, it's ultimately sort of an organism that works itself out, and the collective intelligence of humanity will prevail. Really, I think it would prevail over plastic. It will prevail, and if it doesn't, then it means plastic was meant to be. So, but to just say that we are changing the way we're already doing things that we don't even understand that we're doing. Our relationship to our environment is already changing. Some of it is positive, some of it is negative. The way we use technology is already allowing us to solve some of the problems, create others, but allow us to sort of also evolve into beings with, whether it's a cell phone that has become another extension of our physical being. It's a tool that has allowed us to communicate with the rest of the world, So I think I'm optimistic, and I think we have to remain optimistic.
I'm actually very optimistic because I think even though we have enormous challenges and nobody thinks otherwise, I think everyone recognizes that. And yet we have enormous capacity, and as we've been discussing, there's enormous resilience in our human systems that surprises us quite often. And as Jane Jacobs said in the closing of Death and Life of Great American Cities, cities contain the seeds of their own regeneration.
Yeah.
And I do believe that. And I believe our human civilizations have the seeds of their regeneration if we can recognize and empower those. But we clearly have to seize this moment and act.
Yeah.
Victoria, optimistic, pessimistic?
I do a lot of interviews with a lot of kind of people living in different kind of areas, all kinds of areas. And I used to see myself as a translator for the information. I take the information, I analyze it, and me and an architect would work on it. And it's like 5 years ago, I was like really understanding everything that I've been hearing. And of course, it's the statistics that will tell me something. It will tell me that the past 20 years, the segregation has increased, the inequality has increased, the environment is, I can see that on data, but when I'm out there talking to people, realizing, actually sometimes coming home crying, I get really, really dark, and I'm thinking, this is not, something is going on that's not good. But then, I see little things are happening, little things there and there. Sometimes there's the right person working at the right place, and things like Me Too is happening. So I'll get optimistic, but realistic. So I'm optimistic, realist as well, as you said. But I'm not. There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yes,
that's for sure. Got to do.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more, because when you live in Africa, you travel in regions that with a lot of challenges, and you really face people that not challenges that we talk about theoretically, but really very basic needs of hunger, of health, and lack of education, and it's very difficult indeed to be optimistic. But people remain happy. It's an incredible thing that they remain happy, and you'd see that energy allows them to be. I mean, there's some resilience in that state of being that would, maybe it's one or two of the 1,000 people that would lift them out of that condition. And I think that's where I remain hopeful that collectively humanity will be okay. I mean, we will evolve, we will change, we will adapt. We will be very different people, but we'll stay on top.
Cecilia, do you have reflections on the optimism?
Well, I'm still an optimistic.
Still optimistic.
I must say, yes, because just as you already mentioned, I think there's enough technology to solve any problem at all. I think as long as we keep working with the public, first. Second, maybe because now I'm the old person usually in every place I go, I think we need to keep the old people working with the young people. I have a lot of trust in the young populations today. I mean, they will come with good solutions. But then as we speak all the time about planning and the future, we always, I think, need to address what have been the mistakes, because we have done a lot of mistakes in the past, and how to move forward. So you always have to keep one step back to keep one step moving forward. And I think we can find a better place to live in this world. Yes. Absolutely.
Well, now that we're getting to the end of what can only be described as a challenging conversation, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, I'd like to move on to what is becoming a tradition in the Delphi Conversations, and that's to invite each one of you to discuss a meaningful photograph that you brought with you today. So maybe we'll begin with Michael. I'll give you that one. And I'll put this up here.
So we've been talking a lot about urbanization, and one of the things that I want to ask about this diagram is, what do we mean by urbanization? We're talking about mistakes as well, right? And unfortunately, I think we can talk about mistakes. This is from 1948, Adolf Bayer, a kind of propaganda piece for the model building after the war. And I think what you can see is that this is the model of a more rational, sanitary, machine-like world with sunlight, space, and greenery, as I said, replacing the horrors of the 19th century, the disease and overcrowding. But there's something very interesting here that goes to what we've been talking about, and that is the loss of public space. There really isn't much public space in this drawing, no real meaningful public space, and there's no real sense of the networks that people are in when they encounter one another, when they create, when they have capacity to start businesses and interact with one another. So I think this is really what Jean-Claude talked about as the kind of paradigm change that we have to recognize. We have to move from this system, which has been brilliant in many ways. I mean, it's created enormous economic growth and expansion, and yet we now realize that it's creating catastrophic problems as well. So as we think about implementing the new urban agenda, I think we need to recognize again, what is the power of the kind of problem a city is, as Jane Jacobs put it, and what are we overlooking when we look at these older patterns of history that might still be relevant to us today, and just because they're old and run down and whatever. So this is, I think, what I think we need to think about with the new paradigm, as Jean-Claude puts it.
I think it's really an interesting image, and we have been talking a lot about urbanization and cities, but I think one of the important aspects that we mustn't forget is also the countrysides, the rural areas, and these are places, again, like you said, where there's still a lot of local intelligence, things that people do naturally that that need to be carried on into the culture of the cities, and more importantly, I would also say that of course, the trend of urbanization is happening. We should also focus on these little villages, small towns, countrysides, to reduce the pressure of people moving out. So they need attention. We mustn't forget those areas. It's the same level of importance that we need to give value to, because in So in 2050, when 70% of the population of the world lives in cities, what happens in the countryside?
I think you're very right. We're too
We're gonna
focused
move
on
back.
big
Yeah.
cities.
Yeah.
We're too focused on only the big cities and not recognizing how many other kinds of settlements there are. And I think that's a very important point.
It's a dichotomy, All right, the next one we have Viktoria.
I feel like we are in sync here because you were talking about the need for public spaces, and I'm going to talk about how they are being used and by who.
Perfect timing.
So my picture, I didn't take this. This is a cooperation that we had with, of course, some of my colleagues, but also a theater group in the south side of Stockholm. So this picture should be credited Unga Turteatern. And these girls had this great, what you call it, interactive theater thing, where two girls in the teens, you actually came to the theater and you took some earplugs and you walked with them in the area and listened to how they experienced the area. And that's, we kept on working with this question, and we call it Flickrum, Room for Girls, which also has been together with the Global Utmaning, another project that's called Urban Girls Movement. And all the times that I've been out interviewing people in public spaces, I was always struck by the lack of girls. Where are the girls? Where are the women? And then a couple of years ago, there was a study out in Stockholm that said that 80% of active places, active public places, is this men, only guys between the ages of 7 until 19. It's quite equal up until 7 in the play yards and after 19. But in there between, where are the girls? And we start to have questions, what are the public spaces? Skate parks? Is it the activity, the parkour parks? Is it the activity that they want something else? So we've been trying in our projects to actually work with feminism urban planning, not to say that guys are not allowed, but to raise the question. We might need to make a park for only girls just to get the question on the agenda. We need to work with gender planning as well. So it's one of the parts that I really feel strong for. And when I talk about this, I realize from people like you that this is an international problem.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Not only that, I'm glad you put it out, because I think the whole agenda of women is going backwards instead of going forward. And we really need to push much harder to have spaces for women and spaces in every sense, from the house inside and to the public space and placemaking.
It's quite scary. I mean, most time when you see a woman in public space in that age, it's on a billboard, halfly nude.
Yeah.
Is that how what kind of culture is this?
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, I have this friend in Addis Ababa who created the first skating park in Addis about 6 or 7 years ago, Mugabe Skate. And the image of a skater in Ethiopia is not necessarily a hip-hop guy with baggy jeans and some cap on. That image did not exist. So one of the big groups that they have, and it was organized, is actually a girl group skating.
Nice.
So his images is like young girls 10 to 11 with the braids coming on.
that's great,
These are the images of skaters, which creates
exactly.
another culture
Different
and how
perception.
you can actually own public space.
That's great.
Well, it raises the question, how can you even speak of public space if such a major constituency of your population is
Excluded from it, yeah.
And, this is a fundamental question for those of us who think about public space. And it also ties into the way the culture is working to value the presence of everyone, including women, as opposed to commodifying them as sex objects and, someone to chase around and harass and so on. And I think, this is part of this larger cultural shift that I hope we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of it in the United States right now, looking at more equality, more respect for one another as valuable human beings instead of commodities and things to be manipulated. And I think that's an essential part of public space and what it is.
That fits in with your discussion earlier on the holistic aspect of understanding it. I mean, we could become perfect at building the right public spaces, but if the perception's not there that those people are allowed to access those spaces or feel safe in those spaces, or if society doesn't think, that's another aspect of cities itself. They're dynamic places, and it comes down to...
Actually, one good example, talking about good examples that we could use. When I was living in Rio, working for UN Habitat, we put together a program with UN Women, and it was precisely, they started in Argentina, in taking over public spaces or parks that were completely derelict, and there were, gangs and drug dealers and so on. And women really started to take it over and make the use of the space for the children and for themselves. And there was space for everybody, but they really had to work hard. And it was very successful, and it's still going on today, which I'm very proud. But yes, there's still a lot to be done. Absolutely. Yeah.
And we have your picture, Cecilia. I'll put that one up there and give you a copy as well.
Maybe it's a compliment to what you already said. And I decided to have something very personal in a way, because this was taking this weekend. It was my birthday, and I was celebrating with part of the family. And I was celebrating in a town called Oaxaca, which was, it's one of the poorest states in Mexico, but it has this fantastic central place. This is the city center, where you can see the activities going on. And we were all very concerned about this woman that you can see on the far is the right. It's a very, very old and poor woman. And she goes every day there and sells sweets that she makes herself. And we were talking to her and listening to what was going on. But you can see that this is a space absolutely open for everyone to go and do their selling, their vending, having activities around. It's always full of life. Sometimes you hear concerts. The other day there were mariachis all of a sudden coming out of the blue. People selling, sweets, cafes all over the place. So it's a fantastic place to spend the day. And one of my children said, this is a wonderful place because you can just sit and see the world passing by. Comes to you. So it's just a reminder that, one, family values are still very important, at least for me. Two, how public space could be a wonderful place to be and enjoy it with the family or with friends. And how you can really, being a poor state, this is still, one of the best places to be around. So it's one of my favorite places.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I like that statement, sit there and watch the world pass by as well.
Exactly.
That's exactly what we expect from our public spaces.
That's right.
Well, and I think we also need concrete examples to show people, new and old, seeing is believing. And we need to, in addition to all of our words, we were obviously talking a lot today, but a lot of it, I think, as well, is demonstrating and celebrating examples that are built.
Yeah. It's a really nice image. It reminds me a lot of a city I spent a bit of time in India, Chandigarh, Le Corbusier, that we had a chat about.
I hope there's a place like this.
Yeah, but interestingly, I mean, India in itself, of course, has that character, and it also reminded me the image that you showed, where even in 2018, you still have relics of all forms of transportation, whether it's the cows or or bikes or people walking, it's this sort of preservation of the richness of history and humanity and things, informality and all levels of social classes coming together. I think these kinds of environments, we need to, even in the Western world, as we get more and more developed, we mustn't lose this quality of life. I think it's very, very important, even at family levels, I'd say. Yeah.
Good point. Yeah. And I'll put up the last photo, Kunle's.
Yeah. Well,
You can tell us about
my
that.
photo will take us a bit, zoom out a little bit back to our sort of global perspective. This is an image by a very good friend of mine, an intrepid photographer called Iwan Ban. He's an architecture photographer. It's an image of New York after Superstorm Sandy in 2012, where half of it is shut down after the flood, and you can see no power and a lot of it is flooded. But it's a very for me a very important image because it really gives us a snapshot and reminds us of the incredible relationship that we have as human beings that have developed cities as engines of civilization, etc., we're sort of able to sort of conquer our environment. At the same time, a very stark reminder that the environment also has huge power over us. And this is this moment where urbanization and climate change come together in this instance. And what's important about this furthermore is that cities, we talk about cities and the growth of cities, it's actually a fact that over 80% of all the major cities and capitals, economic capitals around the world are by water. So, and with the issues of climate change, so we're now there's a convergence of humanity at places where, of course, there's threats of climate change. So we really need to negotiate that relationship a lot better.
Kunle, actually, I have a story about that because I was living in New York at the time.
Okay, well, tell
And,
us
I'll tell you one-on-one
Yes.
because the UN is very near for the limit of what
absolutely.
dark was about.
Yeah.
And then we were all laughing because all of a sudden you would see people in these posh buildings carrying buckets of water, carrying on. And then people would say, now you will understand what we say about lack of water and carrying buckets
Exactly.
in
Suddenly
my town.
the developed regions became the
all of a sudden,
Right,
yes,
developing
yes,
region.
yeah,
It's this moment where
right.
the climate change really has a physical and tangible impact
That's right.
on what we call civilization.
Yeah.
You know?
You realize we're all vulnerable.
We're all vulnerable.
Yeah,
Part of the
absolutely.
same system.
exactly.
And the issue of climate change, I wanted to touch on that before because I think it's such a fundamental sort of lens issue for everything else that we face. It's not the only issue. If we miraculously were able to solve climate change tomorrow, we'd still have resource depletion, habitat destruction, pollution, social issues, all the things that we talk about. And yet, it's a little like public space. It's a framework that brings all these other issues together in our thinking, and it's the ultimate systems issue. It's a global issue. It's an issue we all have to work on. So I think it's very important that we have a sort of joined up moment in history right now between the Paris Climate Accords, the UN New Urban Agenda, and the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think we can use this moment to recognize the interrelated nature of our challenges. And I love that picture.
And going about economy, just as you mentioned, and you were mentioning UN Habitat Executive Director Jean-Claude, he used to, I loved his ideas always about Manhattan, because I used to say, this is one of the most capitalistic cities in the world, and at the same time, it proves precisely the value of placemaking in public space, because Manhattan has 60% of public space
Amazing.
in the city.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you think, okay,
Yeah.
that really makes you wonder. We need to put the figures into the economics
yeah.
of what public space is about, because that's the best example.
Really changes the perspective.
Really change the perspective. You think, wow, the most capitalistic city in the world,
Yeah.
60% public space. If
space,
something is going wrong here in the world, we should think about it.
Well, how could you take take penniless immigrants from Ireland and Italy and Russia and turn them into middle class shopkeepers as New York has done for generations? This capacity that cities have is so
Transformative
powerful.
nature. Yeah.
And so this is what we really need to understand and harness, because it's such a great power to deal with the challenges that we have.
And how they were able to just mark the streets and leave it for posterity, and that make a real change.
Shows
And
a
I
lot of
mentioned
foresight.
a lot of foresight, and then how people put the money to create the Central Park that was created, which was amazing. So yes, I mean, it pays off to provide public space. That's the biggest lesson.
I like the way you framed it as well, Kunle, saying it's a negotiation, urbanization and the environment, and many other issues as well. There's always that gentle negotiation that needs to take place. Sometimes we exceed our welcome, and sometimes the nature has to
Yes.
come back
Right.
and let us know
Reclaim
that.
it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What
Well,
about your picture?
I'm going to put up one last photo,
Brought your picture,
which is,
Farrell.
I should have brought a picture, which is a tradition among the Delphi Conversations, and that's the Delphi Oracles, which is all about unveiling the truths. And I think today's discussion was putting a lot of truths forward, but I think there's always room for much more discussion and healthy debate. So on that note, I would like to thank our speakers here today. Kunle Adeyemi, traveling from Lagos to be with us here today from Lay Arkitekture. Cecilia Martinez, former UN Habitat, but traveling from Mexico City. Viktoria Walden from White Architects, Stockholm. And Michael Mehaffy from the Center for the Future of Places, traveling from Portland, Oregon to be here with us today. But I must say it was a very enlightening conversation. So I would like to thank you all for being here. And my name is Kyle Farrell, and this has been the Delphi Conversations put on by the Center for the Future of Places at KTH. And we hope you tune in for our next discussion. Thank you.